Okay, last time we started our discussion of the development of social cognition by introducing you to basically the notion of the theory of mind, and there are 2 points to be made there. First is the theory of mind really is all about social cognition, because what social cognition is all about is trying to figure out what somebody else is thinking, or believing, or wanting, or desiring, or whatever. And then we talked about some studies of the development of the theory of mind in human infants, mostly based on the so-called false belief task, which revealed that before about age 3, little kids don't seem to pass the false belief task. After about age 5, they tend to, strongly tend to. And we talked a little bit about a nonverbal version of the false belief task that pushes the envelope back a little bit and suggests that even children as young as 15 months might have a rudimentary ability to figure out what's going on in somebody else's mind. And then we stopped with this neuroscientific study by Sachs and Canwisher, which seemed to indicate that when adults are reading stories that require them to impute mental states to other people and reason about other people's mental states, there's a particular area of the brain that gets activated up here in the temporoparietal junction, which is now sometimes called the theory of mind area. Now, almost all of the literature on social cognitive development has been based on this theory of mind task. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of studies have been used using this task. But it's important for you to understand that that's not all there is to either the theory of mind or the development of social cognition. So, for example, Henry Wellman at the University of Michigan has argued that there are a whole bunch of aspects of the theory of mind that go beyond simply passing the false belief task. And he and his colleagues have tried to develop tests for these various kinds of other aspects of the theory of mind. So, for example, we'll just do 1 or 2 of these. There's what Wellman calls diverse desires. You present the child with 1 of 2 snacks, either carrots or a cookie, and you ask the child to state his own preference, okay? And then you introduce Mr. Jones, this other character, fictional character, who wants the other thing, and then you ask the child which snack Mr. Jones will choose. And of course, what should happen if the child is performing correctly is the child will understand that Mr. Jones will make a choice different from the child's own choice because he wants something different from what the child wants. Here's another one. This is so-called contents false belief. You present the child with a Band-Aid box, and you open up the Band-Aid box, and you show the child that there's a toy pig inside. And you say, what's inside the Band-Aid box? The kid says, there's a toy pig inside the Band-Aid box. Then you introduce a new character, Peter, who's never seen this particular Band-Aid box, and you ask the child, what do you think Peter will think is inside? Now, the correct answer, of course, is that Peter will think there are Band-Aids inside because it's a Band-Aid box, but you could fail this contents false belief test if the child believes that Peter knows what he or she knows. 1 more of these. These are all the lecture supplements. A test for understanding the distinction between real and apparent emotion. The child is presented with schematic diagrams or photographs of 3 emotional faces, 1 happy, 1 sad, and 1 neutral. And she's told that there's this little girl, Rosie, who tells a mean joke about a little boy, Matt. And in response, Matt tried to hide how he felt. And what the child's task is to point to the picture that represents first how Matt really felt. Of course, Matt should feel sad. And then how Matt tried to look to the other people when he was trying to hide how he felt. And the answer there is he might look happy or perhaps neutral. Again, all of these tasks involve dealing with other people's mental states and reading other people's mental states. And the point of this is that when you administer these tests that go beyond the mere false belief test to a bunch of 3 to 5-year-olds, what you see is that their pass rate varies very systematically. 3 to 5-year-olds are very likely to pass, say, diverse desires test and the diverse beliefs test, but they are relatively unlikely to pass tests about emotion. So what you've got is what the psychometricians call a Gutman scale. A Gutman scale means if you pass one test, you're going to pass other tests, and these constitute a kind of Gutman alignment here, so that if you pass diverse desires, you're not necessarily going to pass diverse beliefs, but if you pass diverse beliefs, you will pass diverse desires. If you pass diverse desires, you might not pass the test of real versus apparent emotion, but if you pass this one, you're going to pass all the others. So again, the idea here is that even once a child, age 3, 4, 5, has passed the standard false beliefs test, there are other aspects of the theory of mind that the child has to develop, and 3-year-olds are pretty good at these, 4-year-olds are pretty good at these, 5-year-olds or older tend to be pretty good at distinguishing between real and apparent emotion. Again, there's more to life here than simply the false belief test. Okay, yes? I'm not sure that there's an implied causal relation. There might be, okay? I think what Wellman would want to say is that there are levels of complexity here, and what the child is doing is building on a rudimentary ability to impute mental states to other people, and then just kind of gets better at it, and the skill becomes more generalized. So I think that would be basically the way we talk about this. Another approach, very prominent approach to the development of the theory of mind, comes from a British psychiatrist, Simon Baron-Cohen, who's the cousin of Sasha, for those who want to know. He has developed a whole theory of what he calls mind reading, the ability to infer what's on somebody else's mind, and he argues that rather than just having a basic theory of mind, there are a whole bunch of things that go into this, and that these show particular developmental trajectories. So that there are these 4 elements of mind reading. What Baron-Cohen calls an intentionality detector is simply the ability to interpret another person's behaviors in terms of their goals. That is, to try to figure out what a person is intending to do. Then there's an eye direction detector, which basically is the ability to determine whether somebody's looking at you or looking at somebody else. There's this shared attention mechanism, I talked about this a little bit before, that has to do with the idea that if you look where somebody else is looking, you'll see what somebody else is seeing. That is, how to get your mind in the same state as somebody else's. And then your standard theory of mind mechanism, which has to do with the ability to understand the distinction between your mental states and somebody else's mental states. Baron-Cohen argues that these are 4 separate and independent cognitive modules, and he also assumes, in line with the neuroscientific doctrine of modularity, that each of these cognitive modules is associated with a piece of real estate in the brain. That is, that there's some kind of brain module associated with the cognitive module. And there are a whole bunch of developmental studies now that show that, in fact, these 4 elements of mind reading are acquired at different times by normally developing kids. So even children who are less than 9 months old have some ability to interpret other people's behaviors in terms of goals, and they have the ability to detect the direction of somebody else's gaze. But it takes maybe another 6 or 9 months for children to develop what's known as the shared attention mechanism, and it takes a much longer time, as we now know, about 4 years or so, for children to develop the theory of mind mechanism as assessed by the traditional kind of false beliefs test. So again, there's a developmental progression here where the intentionality detector kicks in very early, and the theory of mind mechanism kicks in very late, with the eye direction detector and the shared attention mechanism coming into play relatively early. We're going to see this same table a couple of times during this lecture. Now, what's interesting, and what got Baron Cohen interested in this, was the study of autistic children. Basically, what Baron Cohen has argued is that autistic children, for that matter autistic adults, lack the ability to read other people's minds, lack the ability to make inferences about other people's mental states, which suggests that whatever else autism is, or whatever childhood schizophrenia might be, or childhood bipolar illness might be, autism reflects for Baron Cohen a specific deficit in social cognition. That's what's wrong with autistic children and autistic individuals. And Baron Cohen and his colleagues have tried to test this theory by using this framework, the 4 elements of mind reading, and assess the performance of autistic children on various aspects of this basic domain. Now, the idea that autism reflects a specific deficit in social cognition is relatively recent, but even in the very earliest descriptions of autistic children, you can see kind of what that's all about. Leo Kanner was the guy who first described autism in a classic paper from 1943, and he's describing this one child that was kind of the index case for autism. He says, look, when taken into a room, he completely disregarded the people and instantly went for objects. He would play with a hand that was held out to him as if it were an object, but that's about it. He did not respond to being called, did not look at his mother when she spoke to him. This is the same child now, never looked up at people's faces. He treated other people, or even their body parts, as if they were objects. He just doesn't seem to relate to other people as people at all. And again, the same child, on a crowded beach, he would walk straight toward his goal, irrespective of whether this involved walking over newspapers, hands, feet, or torsos, much to the discomfiture of their owners. You got to get this image of this kid on the beach plowing right across these individuals. His mother was careful, but he didn't do this intentionally, right? He didn't say, oh, I'm a mean little kid, I'm going to walk over people and make their lives on the beach miserable. He just saw his goal and went straight for the goal and didn't pay too much attention to the needs or the concerns or the wants of the people in between. It was as if he did not distinguish people from things, or at least did not concern himself about the distinction. So here we have the earliest published clinical description of an autistic child, and it looks very much like this is a child who doesn't recognize other people as sentient beings with goals and beliefs and desires and feelings of their own. What Baron Cohen and his colleagues and other people have done is to try to bring this basic hypothesis into the laboratory and see how it works out. So again, this idea that autism involves some kind of fundamental deficit in social cognition has now been embraced by the psychiatric establishment. Here we have the criteria for autism as in DSM-4. I know there's a DSM-5, but DSM-5 collapses a whole bunch of different developmental disorders together, okay, which personally I think is a very bad idea. But I want to keep, we stick with DSM-4 precisely because I want to make a distinction between 2 related but distinct mental illnesses in children, autistic disorder and Asperger's disorder. In both these conditions, we see gross impairments in social interaction. Both of these the kinds of patients engage in repetitive and stereotyped behavior. But whereas a classically autistic child, the Kanner syndrome child, the kind of child described by Leo Kanner, has a lot of impairments in communication, children, adults for that matter, with Asperger's disorder experience little or no problem with communication, and for that matter, little or no delay in cognitive development. What's striking about patients with Asperger's disorder is that they typically have normal or even high levels of intelligence at the same time as that they're grossly impaired in their social interactions. And it's this kind of dissociation, the dissociation between normal analytical ability on the one hand and gross impairment in what you might call social intelligence on the other hand, that suggests that to people like Howard Gardner, that these 2 kinds of intellectual ability, these 2 kinds of cognitive abilities are mediated by different kinds of cognitive modules. Okay, so what happens when you study the children who are diagnosed with autism and compare them to other children? You do see that they begin to fall down in various tests of what Baron Cohen would call mind blindness. Here is Baron Cohen's first study. It's as good as any of the other studies that have been done. He's got normal children who are more than 4 years old, so these are children who should be passing the false beliefs test of theory of mind. Then there are some blind children in this particular study, some mentally retarded children in this study, children with IQs less than 70, and then it turns out that there are 2 groups of autistic kids. And what you can see is that all of these children have something like an intentionality detector. They pass these rudimentary tests that are passed by 9-month-olds about inferring people's goals, and they all seem to have what's known as the eye direction detector. They can figure out whether somebody's looking at them or not. If you want the details of these tests, it's in the lecture supplements. But there's one group of autistic kids that passes the test for the shared attention mechanism. That is, when you point, the child will look where you're pointing. Okay, that's the basic test here. That one group of autistic kids passes this test. The other group of kids, autistic kids, doesn't. But neither group of autistic kids will pass the theory of mind test as assessed by the standard false beliefs test. So here, in this blank area, we have evidence that in fact there does seem to be a problem with that specific aspect of mind blindness, problem with mind reading, known as the theory of mind mechanism. Now this is now a dominant theory about autism. That autism is a specific deficit in social cognition that's characterized by the child's lack of a theory of mind. There is some controversy about this, however, you should know. But here is another study, a more recent study by Candida Peterson, in which she compared normal children who were aged 4 to 5 years. Okay, these are autistic children who are about double their age, and she administered three variants on the standard false belief test, just to kind of get more than a one-point scale. And what you can see here is that no matter which variant you use, the autistic children who are 9 or 10 years old by this time are scoring poorly on this test, on any of these tests, compared to normal kids who are only about 4 or 5 years old. So again, there's this basic finding that autistic kids, when tested, do poorly on the false belief test and other tests, other measures of the theory of mind. Okay. Now there's a problem with this, of course, which is that you don't really know what's cause and what's effect here, and you don't. Many of these studies have not looked at the development of theory of mind in children with other kinds of disabilities. Peterson solved this problem. Again, she's got these normal children aged 4 to 5 years of age, autistic children aged 9 or 10. Then she got into her experiment a group of deaf children who were also aged 9 to 10 years old. Deaf children that represented 3 different groups of kids. These are native signers, children whose parents used sign language pretty much from birth and who acquired sign language the same way normal hearing children acquire their native language. What's interesting about this is that deaf children of native signers have pretty much normal social interactions with their parents. Okay, they're communicating with their parents all the time, just through sign language, not through speaking. Then there's a group known as the oral deaf who are trained to speak, even though they can't hear very well, but they still have some communication with other people. And then there are these children who are called deaf signers from hearing families. These are deaf children who are born to hearing parents. Everybody else in the family that has adequate hearing as well, and they learn sign language very late. And what's important about this group is language is how you deal with other people, right? So if you learn sign language really late, there's this whole bunch of time in your childhood when your social relationships are very impoverished. So Peterson added these deaf children to the experiment, gave them the 3 false belief tests. And what you can see here again is that the autistic children do quite poorly on this aggregate measure of theory of mind. But when you now add the deaf children to the group, the native the signers do quite well on the theory of mind test. The oral deaf also do pretty much okay. They're doing about as well as the normal kids. But the deaf child of hearing parents not doing very well on the theory of mind task at all. Now, these deaf children of hearing parents are not autistic by diagnostic standards, but they're still performing very poorly on these theory of mind tests, presumably because their interpersonal interactions in early childhood have been so impoverished. So there are two things to be learned from an experiment like this. First, theory of mind deficit is not specific to autism. There are other kids out there with other disabilities who also have a deficit in the theory of mind. The second and more interesting possibility is that the usual theory, the Baron-Cohen theory, if you will, is that the theory of mind deficit causes children to be autistic. Okay? But this study suggests a hypothesis that the theory might actually be reversed, that poor social interactions during childhood cause the theory of mind deficit. Okay? Because that's what seems to be happening here. These children are not autistic in any sense. So although the theory of mind hypothesis is these days, by any stretch of the imagination, the most prominent theory about autism, there are some problems with it. Problems that were summarized by Helen Tager-Flussberg, Australian. Actually, she's an American psychologist working in Australia. It turns out that not all autistic kids have a theory of mind deficit. Okay, some Asperger's children, for example, don't seem to have it. It's definitely not unique. There are children who have problems other than autism who also fall down on these theory of mind tasks. Autistic children, Tager-Flussberg points out, have other problems besides problems in social cognition. They have a lot of problems with executive functioning in general. Okay, you've got this confound with language. Autistic kids don't have language skills. Language is a serious problem. If you think about administering the false belief test, I mean, you really got to have some complicated language skills. And especially Tager-Flussberg points out that these studies of autism have relied excessively on the false belief test, the standard false belief test for their experiments. They don't even necessarily involve nonverbal versions of the false belief test, such as revealed some false belief performance even in 15-month-old kids. So here's where we have an example. It comes up sometimes in psychology where people get fixated on a paradigm, the false belief test, the Sally Ann test, whatever you want to call it, and they just stick with it and they don't develop a richer apparatus of tests. So the idea that autism involves a specific deficit in theory of mind is very popular, might actually be true, but it's not completely evident yet that it's correct. Okay, so again, even if it were correct, there are lots of different ways you could get to the same endpoint. Again, the traditional theory about the theory of mind and autism is what you might call a neurological account, the kind of account favored by Baron-Cohen, which says that there's a specific module in the brain that mediates performance on theory of mind tasks, and in autism, that brain module has been compromised somehow so that the kids can't perform on it. That's the standard theory about autism. But you can easily imagine, especially given Peterson's work with deaf children, a completely environmental account of this problem, which is that social cognition has what a number of people call a conversational basis. The way you learn about other people's mental states is by interacting with other people. Anything that prevents you from interacting substantially with other people is going to lead you to have some kind of theory of mind impairment. So we do have in some deaf children, and for that matter in some aphasic children, there are kids out there who had strokes and have speech problems, and by virtue of their speech problems don't get a lot of communication with other people, and they also show theory of mind deficits. Or you could put nature and nurture together, if you want to think about it that way, into what's known as an interactionist account, that what happens in autism is not that there's an impairment in some theory of mind module, but there's an impairment in some brain structure that affects social interaction in general. And it's the lack of social interaction that leads the child to fail to develop a theory of mind. So here you could have a piece of the neurological account where there is some kind of brain impairment, but the brain impairment doesn't directly affect theory of mind processing. It affects social interaction in general, and the problems with social interaction then provide the kind of environmental thread here that causes the child not to develop